Should Roy Moore be shown the door? And should HIV transmission be criminal? Coming up today on The Point. Hello and welcome to The Point, the only talk show bringing gay and straight men together to see what happens. Hello, everybody.
Hi, Fred.
Hi.
Including podcaster Leah Abrahams is back.
There you go. Hello, hello.
And Jim is here, and Tito is here, and Zayd is here, and Doug is here. It's all very romper room, right? But this is not very romper room. Maybe this is a bad segue.
Yeah, that was like a weird.
Really weird.
But talking point number one, God, more is less. Okay, so Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore.
They should not be equal on that screen.
Well, okay. That's part of the discussion.
That's a good question, yeah.
Okay, so
I don't know her.
he has been. There are allegations from a number of different women that he sexually harassed, molested, attempted rape women, girls as young as 14.
I heard 13.
Pedophilia.
Maybe 13.
But like,
okay.
way
so
too young.
there are, and he's a Republican. He's running in a special election from the state of Alabama. He also has a history of evangelical Christianity, homophobia, blah, blah, blah. He actually was twice, he was the head of Alabama's Supreme Court, and twice he was thrown off the Supreme Court for not following state laws about putting the Ten Commandments in the courthouse. He was against Alabama giving marriage licenses to gay couples, even though the Supreme Court said they had to. Now there are these issues, there are these sexual, child sexual allegations. This is in the context of Harvey Weinstein and all the other sexual harassment claims that are coming out, including, most notably, Al Franken, a Democrat senator from Minnesota, also comedian,
yeah.
Saturday Night Live. There are a couple of allegations against him. Actually, allegations, he admitted to one of them after the woman came forward and said, yes, I did that and I'm sorry and I support an ethics investigation, blah, blah, blah.
And the woman also forgave him in that particular
Yes.
context and whatnot. So that's another thing of like.
Question number one, and I think everybody's going to agree on this.
Let's hope so.
Should Roy Moore be allowed to stay on the ballot?
No.
Yeah. No, I'm kidding.
Absolutely.
Because there are people, Trump said, well,
Okay.
well, he denied the allegation, so...
Well, did you hear?
Obviously
Did you hear that Trump just recently denied that it was him who said grab her by the pussy?
Yeah, yes.
After admitting to it last year, he's just
but
come out
that's on
recently and said
camera,
that
though.
wasn't me.
That's silly.
Yeah.
He's done.
He should just leave that one alone.
I think
would
we should
think he
stop
would
being
leave that
surprised
alone.
at the bar dropping.
Yeah.
No, we're not.
Yeah.
And we're
Well,
not.
there was I believe it's the state auditor of Alabama actually kind of is giving Roy Moore a pass on this, and he's a Republican as well.
Genius.
Because, well, Joseph and Mary.
Yes.
Mary
Yes, I
was
heard that.
a teenager.
Act. Are you joking?
That's actually
No, I'm not joking.
Mary had the baby through other means other than sex.
Right,
That's
it was
in the Bible.
immaculate.
Yes.
Isn't that the...
That's what it's the Bible.
I'm not
Magic.
right. I'm not a Christian, but I know that Joseph and Mary didn't have sex. That's the whole point of the story.
There's
That's
two
actually the
points
whole
to
point of the
that.
story.
There's that point, but there's also the point that it's a made-up story that didn't happen.
That's it. Yeah.
So, but
not gonna
regardless,
get into that right
regardless,
if
Can't
you
make
believe
it-
your
Can't make
defense,
claims like that.
your
No,
defense
you know.
is either look what happened
Jesus
with
did it.
something that was a made-up story, or look what happened where someone had no sexual contact whatsoever.
Yes.
You cannot use it regardless of what you're saying here.
Also, it goes against the Bible. So why would you make a statement that goes against exactly what you're
Preaching.
professing?
Yeah.
Roy Moore also said, and others have also claimed this as well, that Roy Moore never dated an underage girl without the mother's permission.
So is he admitting to...
Genius. There's a
he
terrible mother in
admitting-
the picture.
So he's admitting it. Is that
Well,
what this
what
is
he
now? We don't
said
have to call it
was he
allegations?
doesn't remember dating an underage girl, but if he did, it wouldn't have been without the mother's permission.
They're talking a little bit
that's
too
like
much.
the OJ if I did it defense.
Yeah, it
Like,
is. It's exactly
If
the
I
same
did do it, I don't remember doing, but if I did do it, this is how I would do it.
And the bottom line is that Roy Moore still has support,
Of course.
in Alabama,
Yeah.
Well, it's Alabama.
mostly among evangelical Christians. And my theory and question about this is this a cultural thing? It's not a religious thing, because if you were truly religious, I don't
wouldn't be
think
for this.
Right. Is this a cultural thing? I mean, we all have this sort of stereotype about Alabama, but and the Deep South. But I wonder, much like you see, like in the show Big Love, right? The Mormon compounds, right? There are modern Mormons, and then there are the Mormons who have child brides on these compounds, whatever. I mean, I know that's a fiction show, but I wonder if
Good show.
it's a good show.
Yeah.
But I wonder if there is a culture in the Deep South where this is actually acceptable and in fact seen as godly. I wonder.
Okay. I have a rebuttal to that, or an explanation for why the evangelical Christians are still steadfast on keeping him elected. Because I come from a very evangelical Christian family, right? And I believe, this is extreme, because I don't agree with this at all, but I believe that they feel like something's being taken away from them. I feel like they think the world, North American culture at least, is moving ahead away from the church and becoming more secular. And that probably scares them. That's probably something that they're not used to. They want to keep the heritage, they want to keep the roots, they want to keep their beliefs going. And by keeping an evangelical Christian senator, what's his position?
Well, he's running for Senate. Yeah,
running for Senate. To have somebody in that position,
He's running, yeah.
kind of keeps that culture, or I guess culture, keeps that belief alive.
But it's the same thing. It whips up the racist base in
But
the
isn't
South
it-
as
it
well.
reminds me of Trump.
Yeah, exactly.
Trump
Like,
supporters as well. They
people,
wanna keep-
women and people of
keep
color and
America
people
the
of
way
different
it used to be.
sexualities. What about white men? What about us?
but
We're
Keep
taking
America
care
the
of
way
it.
it used to be, right?
But
And I
isn't-
think that's how they see it too.
But aren't there better messengers for that?
Yes, you'd
than
hope that they
Roy
would.
Moore?
You would hope that they
don't think
would
they're looking outside the
hold
box.
their elected officials up to the standard of their religion. But they don't, and it's because I think they're feeling desperate that, as you said, that they're losing their identity.
I mean,
It's desperate.
look at Kellyanne Conway,
desperation.
for example. Like, she's not an evangelical Christian.
Yeah, but her job is to
I understand
pimp
that that's
for
her
whatever-
job, is to
whoever's paying
but
her.
she basically said, and she has daughters. She basically said that it's better to have an alleged child molester in the Senate than a Democrat.
Yep.
Well, this reminds me of women who voted for Trump. After him saying grab her by the pussy, they were all like, yeah, but you know what?
He can
There's
grab
still
this
something
pussy.
about him that I
Yeah.
want to keep elected. Like, this reminds me exactly of that. They want to keep his value, the core values that they believe is within that Moore guy.
Yeah,
But you know what?
it
Part of
shouldn't
it, I don't
be
think it-
shocking. Yeah.
Sorry.
It shouldn't be like shocking. The day a confessed sexual predator won the presidency is the day the bar couldn't go through the ground because it's so low. Yeah. Also,
Well, now it has,
particularly
because
happy
Roy
about
Moore is he's a predator of children.
Roy Moore and Trump,
actually
like
crazy.
Anderson Cooper said, can take dumps on their desk and still have support.
Okay, but
I think
here's
it's beyond
here's,
rational
okay, but-
support.
okay,
You're saying
so-
why, and I understand. It's
This
a good
is
question.
the mentality of people standing someone, like being a fan.
I wanna point out
it
his
doesn't matter
hypocrisy.
what you do. If you have somebody who loves you, no matter what you do, like you're gonna have support.
Unconditional love.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like
Okay,
if
it's not
Beyonce killed a
rational.
kitten tomorrow, I would still love Beyonce and she could never do no wrong. Like,
But how about
that's
if
the
she was
same thing.
raping little girls?
Well,
Because that's what this
but like
is.
that's what standing mentality is. Like they're so crazy in love with. You see what I did there?
I almost missed it.
Okay,
That
so
they just don't care.
So then it brings up the issue of Al Franken and Democrats.
I
who
want
have
to
been-
chime in on this.
Yeah. If is it hypocritical for Democrats to say down with Roy Moore, but then still stand by Al Franken.
Yes.
Yeah. No.
And let's just point out a Democratic or usually left-wing hypocrisy is that either left or right-wing, like the allegations are mostly coming from Hollywood, from California, which is a very blue area. Let's just say that, okay? And yeah, he's a Republican, but
Moore is.
Moore, yeah. Sorry, not Al Franken. It's just I'm not saying that stepping down should be the end of the punishment. That's not sufficient. Like, these are criminal charges and blah, blah, blah. One apologized, one did it. Good for you if you want to redeem yourself in the public eye. There's still a law that needs to be followed. Do you know what I mean? And the other thing is that the Deep South and everybody who's still supporting Roy Moore, who's threatened by secular, ideologies spreading, is the same people who vote for too many of another ideology coming into their borders. Like, oh my God, what about the Muslims? And what about their barbaric, what's it called? And it's funny because the left and the right, at least after 2001, completely threw people of color and Muslims and Arabs under the bus in terms of representation for exactly these things. This is a religion that chastises women, that is very oppressive and whatever. And here we are, looking at a child molester, the same people who are scared of Islam and
we know they're hypocritical.
Who are saying, no, the left too. Like, the Hollywood is a very liberal.
But let's not for a second say that what Al Franken is accused of and what he's dealing with is equal to, and that's why I think we need to be careful in all of these discussions in society. I don't just mean us, but in society of equating. There's good, there's evil, there's nothing else. Like, there are shitty things that people do. There's scumbaggy things that people do. There are just deplorable, should not be allowed to be part of society things that people do. Like, there are different levels of severity of what people do.
And that should be recognized.
And needs to be brought in as part of the discussion. And so then saying what Al Franken is accused of and what he did, that's shitty. It's kind of scummy to write a sketch where you have this beautiful woman kissing you and blah, blah, blah. But then when that woman forgives you and it's a different thing, I don't know if there are more allegations. I'm not saying let's just say he's a great guy, he's perfect, whatever. Let's deal with that situation as it is. But let's not pretend that it's equal to what Roy Moore is accused of.
But who's doing that? Who's equating the two?
The Republicans.
Are they actually?
Republicans.
Thank you for telling me. Did not know that.
I think
that Al Frankenstein. How could I forget that tweet?
Is a very valid point. It's like you have to be able to separate the two, right? You can't say, well, if we do all this with Roy Moore, well, how about Al Franken? No, Al Franken is a separate thing altogether.
They all are.
You have to deal with Roy Moore first and be like, Roy Moore did a very deplorable thing. Deal with that, and then separately, deal with Al.
I mean, to me, it's part of a bigger thing. It's like the climate change thing. It's sort of like you have someone who says that climate change, a scientist who denies climate change, giving an equal amount of time to discuss their point as the people who say, the scientists who say that climate change is happening. That's 98% of scientists. They don't deserve equal time. It can't be presented equally. Okay. And that's a folly in how we discuss some of these topics.
But now we're even getting to the point where we're relitigating Bill Clinton.
Yep.
Yeah.
These are all different stories. One is a pedophile, the other one's a sexual harasser at work, and the other one is a sexual harasser at work and a president. Essentially.
Right. I mean,
which one is worse?
I think the Bill Clinton thing, I mean, there were other allegations, but the Monica Lewinsky thing, and I don't want to go down the Bill Clinton rabbit hole, but the Monica Lewinsky thing was consensual.
Yeah, but he was in a position of power.
I understand that.
But you're saying it's separate from sexual harassment or sexual assault.
Like unwanted sexual.
Definitely separate from a pedophile.
Okay.
And we definitely have to make those lines very clear.
As a society, have to. Yes. Have to.
Of course.
And that's a little bit. I mean, it's a lot more nuanced, and I didn't really get into it, and I won't get into that here. But that's a little bit kind of what I was alluding to when I was talking about how language matters in the other show. About how it is important to use words appropriately, and when something is abuse, and when something is violence, and when something is whatever, and that things aren't always equal, and it's important so that we're able to discuss things appropriately and take proper course of action to be moving society in a positive direction.
And I also love this idea that Trump brought up, which is if you did something bad but you admit to it, then you're bad and you should be punished. If you did something bad and you don't admit to it, you deny it.
Then you probably didn't do it.
Then you probably didn't do it, which I think is a horrible message to send
I think it's
society and to children. But I think
everyone,
everything he does is a bad. Anyway, in case we weren't talking about serious enough topics. Coming up in a second, we have Richard Elliott, the Executive Director of the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network, and he will be here right in a second. Right back. We'll be right back.
Be here soon.
And now it's time for talking point number 2. Is it a crime? And as promised, we have a special guest today, Richard Elliott, the Executive Director of the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Nice to meet you, Richard.
And we invited you on today to talk about the issue of HIV criminalization. And you had said this is really good timing because World AIDS Day is coming up, and your organization, in connection with other organizations, is releasing a statement around this.
Right.
This actually started coming up as a topic. Tito and I were discussing this a few months ago when there were news stories, at least in the Toronto area, about someone who was being charged with purposefully infecting other men with HIV. And then we had talked about it, and I mentioned this to another friend of mine who is HIV positive, and he was saying, because I thought, truthfully, I thought this is a good thing. Of course, this guy should be, because he went about and he lied to people, and
Well, those are the allegations, right?
right, yes, allegations. But then this other friend of mine who is HIV positive said that no, there's a lot wrong with this law because he, as somebody who is HIV positive, has to go through all these steps before he ever connects with somebody. Like, he actually texts people, even if he doesn't have their number, he'll ask for their number and text them to say, I'm HIV positive, just so that there's a record that he disclosed. What are the legal issues here?
So in Canada, the charge that is most often laid is aggravated sexual assault. So that's one of the most serious offenses in our criminal code, carries a maximum penalty of life in prison, and if you're convicted, mandatory designation as a sex offender, presumptively for life, but at least 20 years. The charge is laid in a number of cases, over 200 cases so far in Canada, and actually it's worth remembering that the majority of those cases are ones in which there's been no actual transmission of HIV. The majority of cases are based on an allegation of exposing someone to what is perceived to be too high a risk of transmitting HIV.
Yeah, what is the law there? Is the law transmitting it? Because I mean, like,
No.
or is
Or
this
coming
like
close to
attempted murder versus murder kind of idea of like, it's like you didn't actually do the thing, but
So the,
You were
the
premeditated or whatever.
supposed threshold in the law is that there has to be a significant risk of serious bodily harm. And if there's a significant risk of serious bodily harm, then the duty to disclose that you have HIV arises. So what the court has said means is if there's a realistic possibility of transmitting HIV, then there's a duty to disclose. If there isn't, then there is no duty under the criminal law to disclose.
As
Now,
a
on
phrase, it sounds like everyone needs to disclose.
well, the way
no
that gets-
medication, no preventative measure is 100%.
Well, actually, no, that's not true, because actually the science has evolved, and this is part of the problem with why the law is too broad in the current formulation. Because on the face of it, it sounds like, okay, well, maybe if there's a realistic possibility of transmitting, it's not unreasonable to say someone should disclose in that circumstance. But when you look at how that's actually been interpreted and applied, it's hugely overbroad in our view. So, like I said, in most of the cases, there's been no actual transmission. In a large number of cases, there's actually been, if you look at the science, no significant risk of transmitting HIV. So we have people, for example, who have been prosecuted and convicted even though they had an undetectable viral load, which we know now means the risk of transmission is effectively zero. And yet people
almost
are
like not
still
having
being
it.
prosecuted and convicted for not disclosing in that circumstance.
Why-
So there was no intent to transmit, there was no transmission, and there wasn't even a realistic possibility of transmission, and yet people are still being prosecuted and convicted. Same goes with people who've used condoms, for example. There's been no transmission, there's been no intent to transmit, and in fact, I would suggest that if you've used a condom, you're actually following standard public health advice, and you're exercising that responsibility of trying to prevent transmission. And if you've used a condom properly and it hasn't broken, there is zero risk of transmission. The virus does not pass through latex, and yet still people are being convicted for this.
So why is this happening?
Question, when they say a real reasonable possibility or whatever, are there numbers attached to that? Because then when you say real, and I'm like, well, I mean, condoms have 99% effective or whatever written on them. Like medications are taken with, whatever, like a preventative medication prep and all that stuff, and even viral ARVs, medications in general, they don't all come with guarantees that you're 100% great.
So the science,
So the law as
yeah.
written sounds like it's be as sure as you want, as long as there's reasonable doubt, or whatever, which is up to theatrics, basically.
Well, and you see actually a lot of variability in the court cases, right? So you have people, depending on which prosecutor is prosecuting the case, what kind of scientific evidence happens to be brought forward,
biases they have.
what kind of biases there are on the part of the judge that's hearing the case. So you see actually, if you look at the 200 plus cases that we know of so far in Canada, which is one of the highest rates in the world, by the way, you see actually people who have been accused of basically doing the very same things with completely different outcomes, acquittals in some cases, convictions in others. So there's a problem with consistency. There's also a problem with the justice system actually not really giving adequate weight to the science that we have. And so you have cases where you've got scientific experts who come forward and have said, you know what, in this case, there was no realistic possibility of transmission, and that's great, and we've seen some acquittals in those cases. But if you don't necessarily have that, then people are still being convicted.
Just to clarify, let's say somebody does lie, or there was a case in the UK of some guy who was going on Grindr. He was using condoms, but it turned out he had pinpricked the condoms beforehand. Is that
That's intentional.
criminal?
So,
And should that be
I
criminal?
mean, that to me, as
Well,
somebody who has nothing,
this is why I'm
seems like
asking.
it should
I
be
just I want to
criminal.
make a distinction
clear
between
line, yeah.
yeah,
Intent to,
Right.
like purposely trying
Right.
to infect someone versus.
is pretty important, right? And it should be in the criminal law.
Yeah, sounds like
our
a
criminal law generally, aside from like the HIV context, the mental state of the person and their mental culpability is relevant, right? So the usual consensus, and it's the consensus of organizations across Canada and pretty much internationally, is that in those cases where you've got actual transmission of the virus and there was actually an intent to transmit, then those are legitimate cases in which the criminal law could be used. But in Canada, we've gone way beyond that fairly rare set of circumstances. Because let's be clear, that case is pretty rare. Right?
It's rare, yes.
Yeah, that's not.
Sounds
and
about
yet
as
that's
likely
the
as a
kind
serial killer.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing though that drives a lot of this discussion, right? Is that
Sounds
impression
like a
of that
serial
case?
Now, I know that you didn't write the law. In fact, you're fighting the law.
Trying to get it narrowed.
Right. Why would this law have been written this way to begin with?
Well, so there is no actual written law specifically about this in Canada, unlike some other jurisdictions, like in a good number of U.S. states, where they did adopt HIV-specific criminal laws, driven largely by fear and stigma and misinformation, especially in the early years of the epidemic. In Canada, there was no HIV-specific law. And so what evolved over time was that prosecutors were taking other offenses that are in our criminal code and throwing them at the wall, basically, and seeing what would stick. And in the end, the Supreme Court of Canada in the late 90s dealt with this for the first time and said, yes, you can get a conviction under certain circumstances for this offense of aggravated assault, or as is now more commonly laid, aggravated sexual assault, which is even more serious offense. But they were clear in that case to say there has to be some degree of risk, and we're going to set the bar at significant risk. And if there's a significant risk, then you have to disclose. Below that, we're not going to say that it's appropriate for the criminal law to apply. But the way it has actually played out, that bar has proven in practice to be really, really low. And so it's been quite simple for prosecutors to get.
Are there ever
When was
numbers
that?
attached to that?
Well, I have that question too. But when did that law? Like, when was that case? Like, when
That
did
decision
that?
was 1998 from the Supreme Court of
98.
Canada. Yeah, and then 5 years ago in 2012, they revisited it, and that's when they said if there's a realistic possibility of transmitting HIV, that's the same thing. And so then the question became, well, when is there a realistic possibility of transmission? And in that case, based on the facts, the Supreme Court was only willing to say definitively, if you've used a condom and you had an undetectable viral load, so like you're wearing a belt and suspenders, then there's no risk of transmission, and there's no realistic possibility of transmission. So in our view, that's overkill and doesn't really give weight to the science that we have, right? Either of those things should suffice to preclude you from being a criminal.
I remember, I mean, I was in high school and university in the early days of AIDS, and I remember same-sex messaging, from public health and the community and all that. And I remember being taught, you assume everyone's positive. You wear a condom, because it doesn't matter what they tell you, they could be lying, they could not know.
Yep.
You protect yourself.
So you take responsibility upon
That's a good
yourself.
message at the time.
Yes.
And it's still a good
I
message.
don't think we've ever gotten that though.
And
When I was in
I didn't hear
school,
that.
no.
I didn't learn about.
No, I mean, I wonder if that's a generational thing, but I also wonder how does the law, the way it's meted out now, does it seems to me, and agree or not, that it's taking away, like, as the negative person,
What's your responsibility?
I have responsibility to protect myself.
Absolutely. And that's part of the concern. I mean, there's the cases of individual injustice that we're aware of, right? Where people are being prosecuted when there was no harm done, there's no transmission, they didn't intend to transmit. In some cases, they've even taken those precautions, safer sex precautions.
So why are they being prosecuted in the first place? It's just like an angry
HIV
person.
stigma, HIV stigma and a desire for revenge.
Is somebody like is somebody saying like, okay, so I have sex with this guy.
He
I'm
didn't
negative.
tell me, and I mad at him. So
I
I'm
found out that he's positive. I didn't get infected.
Yeah.
But I found out he's positive,
mad.
so
I'd
I'm
like to know.
complaining to.
That happens a lot.
Yeah, well, it happens enough that it's a real concern. It's one of the major concerns for people living with HIV across this country. We hear regularly, you know, I could be accused of this no matter what I did. And this is why the example you gave at the beginning about someone who texts someone so that there's a record, because they want to have some proof that they in fact disclosed.
Yeah.
But is it at this point, like with the trend of medications and things and how it's sort of going, that it still counts as being positive if you have an undetectable level?
Well, you're still positive. You still have HIV. It's
Right,
just
but
you're
I mean,
not
like,
posing any risk.
but
of
if there's no
transmitting
risk,
sexually.
does that really count? You know what I mean? Like,
Well,
Do you
but it-
still have to disclose if you have a low viral load, I think is what you're asking.
Yeah, that's
well,
the
and we
question.
say no. You should not have to. You certainly shouldn't be a criminal for not disclosing.
Yeah,
it would
I
be
think
the
we can
same
all
risk
agree with
as
that,
me, who doesn't to
Exactly.
would pose to
Your
you,
HIV status
like-
should be irrelevant in that circumstance.
Yeah.
And yet, we're still seeing this sort of operation of the criminal justice system. And frankly, that's rooted at a certain point in just HIV stigma.
That's so weird.
right?
Like, I feel like if I was hooking up with somebody who had it, like, I would want them to tell me, even if I didn't ask them if they were.
That's
Right.
what I think as well, because then it determines maybe that person doesn't then want to continue having sex with you afterwards,
Yeah.
right?
But what if there's no risk of transmission?
Even still,
Shouldn't that be their choice, though?
You're
to
Technically
decide if
more
they want
at
to
risk
continue
of
or not?
getting HIV from someone who thinks they don't have it.
Well, that's,
And that's
that
an
was my
important
other
public policy.
question,
Yeah,
which
then a
is
person
I
What
know,
it
but,
does
like,
and
I would
tells
rather
everyone.
know that somebody
But if you
has
tell
it,
everyone-
even
I
if they
understand
can't
what
give
he's
it to me,
saying,
like,
yeah.
I would still like to
But
know.
there are
disclose that
let me
information,
ask
I
you
would
this:
like
what
to
if
know.
what if you would rather not sleep with someone who's married, and you ask them and they say, no, I'm not married, but in fact they are? Is that a sexual assault?
No.
It's dishonest.
They made you a
It's
cheater.
dishonest,
But should it
and
be a
it's
sexual?
wrong.
Okay, but should it be a
We don't-
sexual
I don't
assault?
think we're saying that it should be considered an assault. I just think
Right,
it should
no.
morally be disclosed.
Yeah.
Right, and I
That's
think
what
there's
I'm
really
saying.
more difference.
but
But you can't
morality and
ethics and law,
legality
right?
You
are
can't
different
legislate
things.
morality.
So what is the law right now? Like,
True.
if I hook up with
Everybody's
somebody
protected. People
who
are likelier to be nice.
is on PrEP and like can't give it to me,
If someone's positive
if
and on
I
treatment,
don't
yeah.
ask and he doesn't tell me,
Well, if he's negative on PrEP, then
sorry,
There's
if
nothing
he's
to
not, if
transmit.
he's not
He's
on
positive.
anything,
Oh.
but like, yeah, if he's positive and I end up getting it, but I didn't ask him if he was positive.
Well, if there was a significant risk or a realistic possibility of transmission, then there would have been a duty to disclose.
Okay.
But how the law understands and defines that is the key thing. And from our perspective, that threshold isn't met if someone's on effective antiretroviral treatment, because the risk is effectively zero. If you've used a condom, the risk is zero. Oral sex, the risk is so absolutely minuscule, it doesn't warrant criminalization.
The one other question I had for you is, I know a lot of people who are, they say they're negative, but they were tested a year ago, 2 years ago, right? As far as they know they're negative, but they don't really know. So let's say, let's say I'm negative. I think I'm negative, but I'm actually positive, but I don't know it because I don't get tested.
You didn't get tested.
I have sex with you. You ask me, I say I'm negative.
Right.
You end up getting infected, and this is how I find out I'm positive, is because I infected you. Am I criminally, as the way
No.
am I criminally responsible?
No, you can't be criminally prosecuted for not disclosing something you didn't know.
So,
But how can you
isn't
prove
it?
that
Is
the
it
person
negligence
knows?
not to know?
So, no, well,
No,
I don't know.
because
I
we
think
don't
in that
normally
case, then you
criminalize
should- Then it's
negligence.
on you to take precautions
this-
as the person, like.
No,
But I think
that's
that's
my
what you're
responsibility.
getting at.
What I'm getting at is then, doesn't this discourage people from getting tested?
Absolutely, and that's one of the broader public policy concerns that we ought to have, right? Like from a public health perspective, that's not good public policy. If you're discouraging people from getting tested, because once you find out that you have HIV, you're at risk of possibly being
Don't
criminally
you
prosecuted.
end up having all kinds of medical complications if you're undiagnosed for it, if you don't know about your status for
Yes,
such
but
a long
not
time?
right away. There's a
Eventually,
window where you
eventually.
Yeah,
don't
6
know.
months or whatever, but
There's
you
a-
go
There's a
die.
window. Yeah.
No, but there's a
big
lot of
thing in
people.
human.
But you could be having sex
long
with
term.
people within that 6-month window.
Which is why you want to encourage people to get tested, right?
So
you don't want to create
right.
another barrier to
there
people
are a lot
getting
of
tested.
reasons why people don't get tested. They don't want to know. They don't want to face reality. They don't want to deal with the medical. And now you're giving them one more reason not to get tested.
And denial's a big thing of like just like no,
That
when I don't
to
know,
me
I can't
seems
deal with
most
it.
really
people, I think.
dangerous, and that's why I asked that question.
Yeah, and that's one
good
really good reason
question,
why we ought to be using the criminal law in a really, really narrow, restrained kind of way, right?
So what is the law right now that you are trying to change?
So the law
or-
right now is people who, if there's a realistic possibility of transmitting HIV, then if you don't disclose, you could be charged and convicted of aggravated sexual assault. The question then is, so how should realistic possibility be understood and defined?
So that's what you're trying to define?
Yeah, we're trying to, well, the courts have defined it and prosecutors have pushed for it to be defined in a really broad, expansive way, including a lot of circumstances that we say there is no realistic possibility of transmission. So you really should have a much, much narrower application of
So
the
can you
law.
not just like I mean like
Shouldn't
shouldn't
be
a bunch
like-
of numbers be associated
Yeah,
with
like
it as Abe is
last
trying to
known
get to?
tests
Like,
for a minimum like threshold of
or,
viral
like
load,
here are the levels. Here's
precautions
you know.
taken.
Yeah,
you
all
know.
those factors should be part of how we define
and
the
you
law.
outline a lot of that in this statement, right?
Yeah.
From the Canadian Coalition to Reform HIV Criminalization, which your organization is a part of.
That's
correct?
right. It's a new national coalition, and we're launching this community consensus statement. Over 150 organizations across the country have endorsed this to say, look, there's a problem here. In fact, the federal justice minister last year on World AIDS Day said, there's a problem here with the over-criminalization of HIV. So now the question is, okay, you've been studying it for a year. What needs to be done about it? And we set out a number of things that should be done.
And so what should be done?
So we should be, certainly we should not be criminalizing people in a bunch of circumstances where they're currently being criminalized. So for example, oral sex shouldn't be criminalized if you don't disclose. If you've used a condom, there should be no criminal prosecution. If you have an undetectable viral load, there should be no criminal prosecution. Even a low viral load under 1,500 copies per milliliter, the science that we have shows no transmissions in that circumstance. So the criminal law should at least exclude those things. We need proper guidelines for prosecutors in every province across the country, because right now, especially in Ontario, where more than half the prosecutions have happened, the really sort of zealous approach to prosecuting is actually what's been pushing the expansive interpretation of the law. So we need prosecutors to actually be reined in by attorneys general. We call in the statement, after a lot of deliberation back and forth across the country, for the federal attorney general, the justice minister, to amend the criminal code and take this out of the realm of sexual assault, because there's a whole slew of people, from HIV advocates to women's rights advocates, feminist legal academics, who have all said this is really problematic, the way the law of sexual assault is being used here. It's not the right tool, and it goes overboard. It's overly punitive. And actually, if you look at the outcomes for sexual assault prosecutions based on not disclosing HIV, vast majority of them end up in conviction, and the vast majority of those end up with prison terms, and the prison terms are more than twice as harsh as the prison terms that are imposed for what we normally think of as sexual assault. So we know that HIV stigma is operating here in the criminal justice system, right? Like we have plenty of evidence of it. And then we need training, of course, for the actors in the criminal justice
It
system.
seems like a lot of this is common sense. Like just like you want to common sense.
Yeah, it
sort
sounds
of
like a very
apply some
broken,
straightforward
not
thought.
common
That's the thing
legal
about stigma.
sense, I guess.
It's sticky, right? Like once it's in the system, it's there, and it's hard to dislodge it.
Obviously, this is a complicated issue. It's a complex issue. People still have questions. If people want to find out more about the work that your organization does, this coalition does, is there a place online they can?
Yeah, absolutely. They can check out our website, which is aidslaw.ca. And you can look at our page
so easy to
on
remember.
criminalization, aidslaw.ca.
Good job.
And it'll take you to a
Name.
lot of links.
Great. Thank you very much. Richard
thank you.
Elliott, Executive Director of the Canadian HIV AIDS Legal Network. This was a pretty heavy show, so I thank you all for being part of it. Of course, if you're watching us on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe. Helps us greatly, costs you nothing. Press the red button. You can check us out on Reverie as well, reverie.tv. Check us out there as well as all of their great LGBTQ content. We're on iTunes as well. If you want to take us on the go, check us out there. And if you like us, please support us. Help us keep going so we can have fascinating discussions and great guests like Richard. That's on Patreon, patreon.com/thepointguys. For everything The Point, go to our website, thepointguys.net, and you can let us know what you think about any of the topics we discussed today. Email us at thepointguys@gmail.com. What is your website once again?
AIDSlaw.ca.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank all of you. We have a new show every Tuesday. So we will see you next Tuesday on The Point.